We are ready.
All right, good. Thank you, Bill. I want to welcome everyone this evening, May Lyme Awareness Month, and PA Lyme has made a decision for the virtual Lyme impact session for this month to really get under the hood of the science as it relates to Lyme and the Lyme controversy. My name is Eric Huck. With us tonight is William Moore, who is on our board and runs the Pittsburgh Lyme Support Group. I am the president of PA Lyme. We're really very, very pleased to have Kathy Rubel speaking with us tonight on a lot of the research that she did. I want to go through just a little bit of housekeeping, if I may. Um, what we'd like to do is, if you have questions, as we do every session, go ahead on Zoom and put it in the question and answer box. If you're on Facebook, you can add your question in the comments section. We will have Kathy do her presentation. We'll gather all of the questions, and at the end, we'll organize them and prioritize them, and then hand them to Kathy for her to address as she sees fit. So we'll be monitoring both of that. In addition to that, the slide deck that we had that is being used, as well as this recording, will be posted on our website probably by the weekend. If you're familiar, PA Lyme does have a YouTube channel. We have all of our virtual Lyme impact sessions there. You also can go to our website and see probably the last 2 or 3 or 4 years, the more recent ones there. I want to just take a moment and recognize that we had last month our patient conference. Every other year, we do a patient conference, and last month, it was in King of Prussia. Wildly successful. We had approximately 70 participants. As you can see on the slide there, we had four main topic speakers. It's important to know that each of these speakers have agreed to allow their slide deck to be on our website. So if you did not get a chance to attend and you're curious what Dr. Neil Nathan may have said about understanding and treating mold toxicity, you can find everybody's slide deck on our PA Lyme website. So in addition to the four main speakers, we had patient health talks. We had 12 exhibitors that included one table of three book authors, gluten-free buffet lunch. It really worked out to be a good day. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge one of the key components that really allowed our conference to be a success, and that is the partnership that we get from some of our sponsors. So I do want to acknowledge the Houston Foundation as being a special enterprise partner. They were very early in our effort to try to get financial backing, and they agreed to become a special enterprise partner. In addition to that, three of the education sponsors, Limecore Botanicals, and that was Dr. Maria Hinchy, who also spoke. Her slide deck is on the website. Turnpaw Health was represented by Dr. Colin Gill. And also we had Relax Momentum Saunas as education sponsors. We were particularly happy that we had some silver sponsorship with Insect Shield. Everyone that attended received some garments that were protected with permethrin. We had an in-kind sponsor of Sawyer. Everyone in attendance was able to go home with a spray can of permethrin and a spray can of Picardin. So without their sponsorship, we really would not have been able to do what we did. We introduced at the patient conference that PA Lyme has rolled out a full script store for vitamins, for supplements, for healthcare products. You may have received an email in the last maybe 3 or 4 weeks. We use the patient conference as an opportunity to let everybody know what we're doing and why we're doing it. The important thing, if you're not familiar with FullScript, please go online. I am always amazed at how quickly the products that I order get shipped to me. 2 day turnaround time is about the average. I am also really intrigued that all of the different manufacturers and providers of products that I personally take are all available on the Full Script store. So PA Line made a decision when we chose to partner with Full Script that if it was available, if it was vetted and approved by Full Script, we were going to make it available to our membership of PA Lyme. So again, it's a 25% discount. And this is as long as they allow it to be as such, it'll be a permanent 25% discount on all your orders, vitamins, supplements, and healthcare products. Your first order, there's an additional 5%. I just saw an order within the past 3 or 4 days that an individual really played it smartly by kind of ordering 2 or 3 months worth of product. In that particular situation, it was about a $3,000 order, which allowed them to have about a 900% discount. $900, not percent, $900 discount, which is pretty amazing when you really look at the economics of the savings that you can get. So free delivery on orders over $50, and you can have more than one Full Script account. I have a Full Script account that was set up for me by one of my many practitioners. And when I set up a PA Lyme Full Script account, when I go in now with my common email address, it asks me, do I want to go into the PA Lyme store or the other practitioner store? So you can have more than one Full Script account. The way to go about and setting up an account, you can go to our website, look for Full Script right on the front page. You can go directly to our welcome page as it is listed there, or you can scan the QR code. This presentation will be on our website, like I said, towards the end of the week. So all of this information will be there for you to review if you weren't able to download that or copy that in time. So we had been getting requests starting about maybe 6, 9 months ago. Individuals that were saying they're not able to drive and geographically get to some of the monthly membership meetings. I, for instance, run the Harrisburg Line meeting. We do it out of Campbell, Pennsylvania. Bill runs the Pittsburgh Lyme support group, and he does it out of Monroeville. But we get emails regularly from individuals that say they can't drive the 60, 90, whatever the distance is. And is there an opportunity to attend a support group virtually? So I want to share with everyone the next one that we have will be next Thursday, May 28th at 7 o'clock. And it's going to be for the audience that's new to Lyme. You're relatively new, recently diagnosed, you're not sure if you have Lyme, you're early into your journey understanding all of the jargon, the vernacular, all the diagnostic, all the tests, you're not sure about the symptoms, you have questions about treatment protocols. This will be an in-person virtual opportunity, and we will be sending out within a relatively short period of time emails, and we'll get it out through social media and our Facebook how you can attend. Um, Really nothing more to say about that. The last, as we kind of close down my introduction here, we are really tickled pink the level of support recently that we've been getting from volunteers wanting to not only donate, thank you for the financial support, but also put some of their time and talent into it. Here's what we really could use somebody that's a social media enthusiast. If you're passionate about social media, if you're passionate about Lyme, if you would like to be on our team and help us to kind of propel this mission of getting information out to the membership within PA Lyme, just really send an email to info@PA Lyme. Let us know you're interested, and somebody will follow up with you. For those of you that have donated recently or you're looking to, you can always go online, palyme.org. There's the donation code right now. The way that we've chosen to do this, it's a delicate balance. We're a 501c3, 98 cents on a dollar. Every dollar we raise, 98 cents goes into our programs. We don't have salaries, we don't have vehicles, we don't have leases, we don't have real estate. We run our operation on a shoestring budget. So, what's really important is those individuals that have said, allow me to help financially. I'm really very pleased to be able to say there are not many 501c3 nonprofits registered with the IRS that can say 98 cents of every dollar that they bring in goes into their programs, into education, programs like this, conferences that we do, the Lyme literate healthcare referral system that we have, all of the Dare to be Tick Aware training, the seminars, the education. So it's really gratifying being a part of this organization to see how much we accomplish with just the limited resources we have. So if that inspires you, please feel free to donate. Brings us really to tonight's speaker. To give a little bit of background on not only our speaker, but also the subject matter, Kathy Rubel has a BA in chemistry from Bucknell University. She has a master's degree in physical therapy from Emory University. She has been on the board of PA Lyme Resource Network since 2018, and she's been a Dare to be Tick Aware facilitator, educator since 2021. In addition to those accolades, she also was a member of the Pennsylvania Department of Health's Lyme and other tick-borne disease interagency work group in 2021 and 2022 when the Department of Health disbanded that working group. Around that time, we started coordinating some of our efforts with the Department of Health. And one of our challenges has always been trying to get out the other side of the story as it comes to Lyme disease. You well know, if you have some experience with Lyme disease, there's two Lyme guidelines. There's the IDSA Lyme guidelines, the original Lyme guidelines that are very restrictive in our opinion, but also ILADS, International Lyme and Associated Diseases Society guidelines that we believe are a little more up to date and a little more patient oriented when it comes to treating the patient until symptoms go away. And as we were trying to develop a relationship with the Department of Health, the challenge they gave to us was give us rigorous science, show us the evidence, show us the science. If we are challenging them on what should be on the website or some of the training or some of the doctor protocols, we were tasked with providing them with evidence and science that's rigorous so that it can meet their standard for what they have to do to vet and make changes to the structure that they have. So it's really in that vein that a lot of this research and science-based evidence was came upon by Kathy Rubel. So in 2026, she's also the Pennsylvania co-team leader for the Center for Lyme Advocacy Legislative Fly-In. In addition to that, she's worked on the U.S. Department of Defense's congressionally directed medical research programs where she reviewed proposed research studies on Lyme and tick-borne diseases. She helped direct which of those research studies would be the most beneficial to pursue really for patients. So I think it's important as you listen to her presentation tonight that you understand she's really speaking to us not only as a Lyme research specialist, but also as a Lyme advocate. but she's not speaking to us today as a healthcare provider. So it's important that you understand she wears multiple hats. She's not talking as a healthcare provider. She's speaking to us really from a background of research science as a specialist. So with that, Kathy, allow me to turn it over to you, and thank you so much for doing what you're doing.
Thanks, and thank you to all the people for joining us this evening. I will share my PowerPoint. So tonight we're going to be talking about Lyme controversy and what does the science tell us. So we're really looking at scientific studies, and we're going to use current studies to look at the unusual characteristics of Lyme. And we're going to look at how these characteristics impact research and diagnosis and treatment of Lyme disease. So research in Lyme in particular is an ongoing process, and we all know there's already a lot of contradictory studies about the mechanisms underlying Lyme disease. So the information we're presenting is based on the scientific studies available today, and future studies, of course, may change our understanding of what's going on in Lyme disease. So this webinar, as Eric said, it is not medical or legal advice regarding treatment of symptoms or disease. This information in the presentation and associated materials is not intended to take the place of advice for your personal healthcare provider or professional advisor. If you have Lyme disease, please see a healthcare provider for treatment. So our agenda tonight, we're going to talk about the unusual characteristics of Lyme bacteria and how these characteristics impact research, diagnosis, and treatment. And we're going to look a little bit at the progress in recognition of long-term symptoms in Lyme disease, and we'll talk very briefly about current and future options in diagnosis and treatment. So why the controversy? There's always been controversy. As Eric said, there's two different guidelines in how to treat Lyme. Where is this controversy coming from? So we're going to talk about each of these more specifically, but there's a lot of unusual characteristics about Lyme bacteria. They're able to evade and suppress the immune system. They're slow growing and difficult to culture. They exist in different forms, including biofilms. They exhibit bacterial persistence, meaning they can completely stop replicating and go dormant, which allows them to persist even after antibiotics. They hide in difficult to culture and treat places. They swim faster than immune cells, and they can create a Herxheimer reaction. All of these are unusual about bacteria, and so they increase the difficulty in research, treatment, and diagnosis. So Borrelia, which is the scientific name for the Lyme bacteria, it can evade the immune system. It affects immune cells to decrease the immune response. It can do this by increasing anti-inflammatory cytokines, which sounds like it would be a good thing, but the anti-inflammatory cytokines actually decrease your immune response, and it allows the bacteria to survive. The Lyme bacteria also inhibits the complement system. So the complement system creates a protein called a complement protein that is able to punch holes into the walls of bacteria and kill them. So the Lyme bacteria is able to inhibit this. So once again, the immune system isn't able to damage the bacteria, and the bacteria survives. Lyme bacteria also hides in privileged areas in the body. So it can be in the eyes, the brain, the joints, connective tissue, collagen areas, areas where there's perhaps less blood flow, harder for immune cells and antibiotics to access. And then interestingly, because of the corkscrew shape and the flagella, the Lyme bacteria actually swims faster than immune cells. So again, makes it very difficult for the immune system to eradicate the bacteria. Lyme has another way that it kind of tricks our immune system. So bacteria have proteins on their surface, and then your body creates antibodies that match those proteins. And when the antibodies find a match, they attach to the bacteria and they mark it for destruction. So Lyme bacteria can actually change the surface proteins. It also can release those proteins into the nearby tissue. So when the antibodies come back, the Borrelia looks different, so it does not get tagged for destruction, and the antibodies get neutralized by the proteins that are now floating around in the nearby tissue. So again, this means that the bacteria continues to survive. So Lyme also decreases antibody production. So our antibodies are made by B cells, and the B cells are made by germinal centers in the body. Lyme can change the structure of these germinal centers so they don't function as well. So the germinal centers are damaged. They can't produce as many B cells. Fewer B cells mean you have fewer antibodies. So when you're very, very sick with Lyme bacteria, it's hard to produce antibodies. So one study was actually done on mice. The mice were infected with Lyme, and then they gave them a flu vaccine. And those mice didn't develop any antibodies to the flu vaccine. So it's important to know that if you're very, very sick with Lyme, your immune system is less able to produce antibodies to protect the body and, again, to eliminate the bacteria. Another unusual characteristic about Borrelia is the Yarish-Herxheimer reaction. So this is common in spirochete infections, but not necessarily other bacteria. And what this is an increase in symptoms that occurs sometimes within a couple days, but it can be as long as 14 days after starting treatment. And the onset of the symptoms, the increase in symptoms can vary, as can the duration of how long it lasts. So there's limited studies about, we call this herxing in Lyme patients, but it may be due to an increase in inflammation. Typically, this Herxheimer reaction is due to endotoxins in the bacteria that get released when the bacteria die. But interestingly, the Lyme bacteria does not have those endotoxins that are typically responsible for herxing. So we're not really sure, but it may be that as the cells die, they're releasing the proteins from their surface, which are then triggering immune activation to clean up the debris in the system. So it may be more of an inflammatory issue in Lyme patients, but either way, it complicates treatment and research. So, and this, I think, is really the crux of the controversy in Lyme disease. So the Lyme bacteria is actually able to change its shape and go dormant to survive. So laboratory studies have shown that the Lyme can become slow growing or dormant, which makes it more tolerant to antibiotics. And then when the conditions are more favorable, when the immune system is not as strong or the antibiotics are gone, these dormant forms can transform back into the mobile spirochetes, and they start reproducing again. So this is electron imaging of the different forms of Borrelia. We're going to talk a little more specifically about each, but the upper left is the spirochete, which is the corkscrew shape that you often hear about. The upper right, this is the spirochete with something called bleebs, which is the outer membrane of the spirochete being excreted into the tissue. The bottom left is called a round body, and this is the spirochete all rolled up into a ball to protect itself. And then the bottom left is what's called a biofilm, and this includes spirochetes, round bodies, and bleebs under like a sticky protective matrix. So the active forms of Borrelia, the spirochete, which we often hear about, long and corkscrew shaped, and it's active and mobile. This is the one that moves faster than the immune cells. And it is highly susceptible to antibiotics. So this is what you'll hear from doctors. Yes, it's very susceptible to antibiotics. And that is true. But when it is attacked by antibiotics, it has a number of mechanisms that it can use to survive. So one of those mechanisms is these bleebs. So with the bleebs on them, they're still active and mobile. The bleebs are little small spherical bumps on the membrane. And this is the spirochete shedding its outer membrane. And then again, those proteins serve as decoys out in the tissue. So the immune system attacks the decoys more likely than the bacteria itself. And then it also forms some inactive forms. And we're going to talk a lot about this evening. So the two inactive forms are the round body and the biofilm. So the round bodies are ball-shaped and they're immobile, and they're triggered when there's an unfavorable environment for the spirochete. So antibiotics or immune system attack, can be lack of nutrients. And essentially these cells become dormant, or they reproduce very, very slowly, and they're tolerant to antibiotics. The biofilm, you can see it's like a dome shape. It encompasses, it's a community of bacteria, both spirochetes and these dormant round body cystic forms. They're enclosed in a protective slime matrix. It's dormant and immobile, but it protects the bacteria under it from antibiotics and immune system attacks. So those round bodies and the biofilms help the Lyme to survive when there's antibiotics. So this bacterial biofilm, it's a sticky protective exterior, and it's more resistant to the antibiotics and other environmental things coming at this that would affect the spirochete but don't impact the biofilm. So, and the biofilm is one of the things that can lead to chronic infection and recurring symptoms. So when you're treating with antibiotics, it may kill off all the spirochetes, but if it doesn't also eliminate the round bodies and the biofilms, once you go off the antibiotics, these can revert. You get the spirochetes show up again and they start reproducing, and your symptoms either continue or recur. So these dormant cells are also sometimes called persisters. So it's a small group of cells that's usually under a biofilm that becomes dormant, and the dormancy enables them to survive the high concentrations of antibiotics, even though the majority of the cells might be killed. So their characteristics are they're dormant, which protects them from the antibiotics. They're slow or non-replicating, and they resume growth after the removal of the lethal stress. And because I think this is a really important part to understand about the controversy of Lyme, we're going to talk a little bit about some studies that really show that the persistence of Lyme bacteria does occur. So in 2026, there was a meta-analysis, which just means it is a study that studies a bunch of studies. So this study looked at 56 different studies, all of which showed that Lyme was detectable in long-term cultures. So after antibiotic treatment, live spirochetes were identified by culture histology or xenodiagnosis. And xenodiagnosis is when you take a sterile tick and you put it on an animal or a human, and you check to see if the tick acquires Lyme disease. So if it does acquire Lyme, then you know the animal or the person must have Lyme still in their system. And this is one way to help identify if somebody may have that biofilm or the round bodies in their system. So out of these 56 studies, there were 10 animal studies and 25 human studies that demonstrated live Lyme bacteria persisting following antibiotic treatment. There was another study that looked up to 18 months and still found live but not cultivatable bacteria. So again, this is the round bodies or the biofilms that were still there 18 months after treatment. So again, confirming the antibiotic tolerant and slow dividing Lyme bacteria that can persist after treatment. So there were also animal studies. This one in particular used ponies. The ponies were infected with Lyme and then were treated with doxycycline, ceftiofur, or tetracycline for 28 days. They then waited 5 months after the antibiotic treatment to test for cultures. This gives time for those inactive forms to reactivate into spirochetes. So when this happened, the doxycycline and the ceftiofur treated ponies were culture positive for Lyme bacteria. Interestingly, the tetracycline ponies were negative on antibody levels and were culture negative. And then we do have a few human studies. These are small, so many of the studies should be replicated with larger samples. But in the first study, we had 12 of 12 subjects with persistent symptoms during or after antibiotic treatment. And the Lyme bacteria were cultured from the blood of 7 subjects, from the genital secretions of 10 subjects, and from a skin lesion of 1. And cultures from control subjects who did not have Lyme were negative for Lyme using these methods. So, and then a second study, we had 107 patients with a typical EM rash, that's the bullseye rash, and the Lyme bacteria were isolated from this EM rash in 28 patients. Follow-up with these 28 culture positive patients showed that 17% of them were still culture positive 3 months after a standard course of antibiotics. So again, this shows that some cases Lyme bacteria survive after the standard course of antibiotics. So, and one of the other characteristics that make Lyme challenging in many ways is that it is difficult to culture. It's extremely slow growing, so its doubling time is 8 to 24 hours versus strep, which is like 20 minutes to 3 hours. And it also requires a specialized substance to grow. So strep, you can put in a regular Petri dish and it will grow and show up positive. But Lyme has to have a special substance to grow. It will not grow in a regular Petri dish. It also exists in very low concentrations in human blood and tissue. So when you take a sample, it may not actually be present in the sample. And then again, because it can change shape and form and stop dividing, if you have the biofilm or the round body forms in the culture, they may not grow because they're not reproducing. And so the culture may appear negative, even though there's some of these inactive forms in it. So how do these unusual characteristics affect our ability to diagnose Lyme disease? So how do we detect bacteria in the body? There's a couple different ways that we can do this. So one of the tests that's used is antibodies. So antibodies, as we talked about, they are produced by the proteins on the surface of a bacteria, and then they're created to respond to those proteins. And then they stick around for a long time, even after all the bacteria have been removed from your system. They're always on the lookout. And this is what prevents people from getting the same illness over and over again. So the challenge in antibodies is, of course, we just talked about that Lyme decreases your body's ability to make antibodies, and antibodies can't tell you if it's a current infection. Because antibodies stick around, it could be from a past infection. So that is one of the challenges. PCR detection of Lyme proteins can be done in urine or blood samples. This might indicate an active infection. We all learned about PCR testing with COVID. It can show that it is an active infection, but there's a lot of controversy about whether the Lyme proteins or DNA stay in the body even after the bacteria have been killed. So it is not for sure positive that it's an active infection. So the main way to tell if it's an active infection is a culture. And you can do a culture of blood, cerebrospinal fluid, or tissues, and this would indicate an active infection. But again, as we talked about, Lyme is difficult to culture. It requires this special media. It grows slowly. It lives in really hard to culture areas, right? If you have strep throat, they can culture your throat. If you have COVID, they can do the Q-tip in the nose. But Lyme doesn't live in those areas. It lives in the eyes or the joints or connective tissue, which is really hard to access to culture. And then again, it can go dormant or inactive, so it may not show up in cultures. So this makes it really difficult for us to determine whether there's live Lyme bacteria. The bacteria also don't typically live in the blood, so this makes it hard to find on blood work. So the number of spirochetes is orders of magnitude below the detection limits of conventional PCR. So this means any PCR sampling that we do has to use special concentration techniques to be able to find the Lyme bacteria or the Lyme proteins. So, and then we talked about Lyme decreases antibody production, but many of the standard Lyme tests look for antibodies to Lyme. So the Western blot, it tests for different bands which correspond to antibodies to specific Lyme proteins. So as Lyme decreases the production of antibodies when you're sicker, you make fewer antibodies, and this can mean that the test is less accurate if you're really, really sick. So, and this is what we see. There's another meta-analysis. It looked at 50 studies, and they used 18 of them that had samples that were known to be positive for Lyme. So the average sensitivity of all the Lyme tests in these 18 studies that looked at these confirmed positive samples was 59.9%. So what that means is if you had 100 test tubes with confirmed Lyme in them, only 59.5% of them would show up positive on these tests. And the sensitivity or accuracy for the two-tiered test, which is recommended by the CDC, was only 53.7%. So what this means is that more than 40% of the people who have Lyme who take these standard tests, they will get what's called a false negative result, and they will be told they don't have Lyme even though they do. So this is really important to understand and would be helpful for more doctors to recognize that these standard tests are not an accurate way to determine if you have Lyme. Interestingly, the specificity, which is the way to tell if people don't have the disease, the specificity is 99 to 100%. So a false positive would be when somebody who doesn't have Lyme is told that they do. And that is very rare in this particular test because it's very specific to Lyme. So those are some of the challenges in being able to diagnose Lyme disease. And these unusual characteristics also make it harder to treat Lyme disease. So the treatment challenges, this immune evasion and suppression obviously makes it harder to treat. So it's helpful to know doxycycline is a bacteriostatic antibiotic, which means that it stops bacteria from reproducing rather than actually killing the bacteria itself. So this means that the immune system has to actually kill the bacteria. With Lyme being able to suppress and evade the immune system, and it hides in connective tissue and other difficult to reach places, this makes it difficult for the immune system to eliminate the bacteria completely. The Herx reaction obviously is also a challenge for treatment. Most bacterial infections, when you start taking antibiotics, you feel better quickly. But in Lyme, if you kill the bacteria too rapidly, it triggers this Herx reaction, which increases symptoms when the bacteria are dying. So treatment often has to be approached slowly to not worsen the symptoms. Persistence obviously is also a treatment challenge, and we're going to talk a bit more about this as we go. So the dormant forms of Lyme, they're antibiotic tolerant. They will survive antibiotic treatments, and these surviving dormant bacteria revert back to active spirochetes, start reproducing again, and they cause the persistence or return of symptoms. So it's really important for treatment to address the different forms of Lyme bacteria. So the round body is one of these inactive forms. In a test tube with 3 days of amoxicillin, the amoxicillin actually caused those Lyme spirochetes, 96% of them converted into round bodies. And then the round bodies are less susceptible to the amoxicillin. So the bacteria that are good at killing the spirochete are not always good at killing the round body form. So in this particular study, they looked at a number of different antibiotics to see which ones were effective at killing the round body form. And they did find 23 antibiotics that are better at killing the round body form than amoxicillin and doxycycline, which are often given for Lyme disease. So the amoxicillin left 46% of the round body cells alive, and the doxycycline left 42% of the round body cells alive. And it's interesting to note none of the antibiotics done singly removed all of the round body cells. So we'll talk a little bit more about double and triple antibiotic use as we go. So, and this question of persistence affects the treatment guidelines. As Eric mentioned, there's two sets of guidelines for Lyme disease. The Infectious Diseases Society of America, IDSA, they do not recognize persistence. So their guidelines are based on the belief that Lyme is easy to eradicate. So their treatments tend to be shorter and they're less likely to retreat because they believe the antibiotics have eradicated all of the Lyme. And the CDC recognizes these guidelines. The International Lyme and Associated Diseases Society, also known as ILADS, they do recognize persistence, and their guidelines are based on the belief that Lyme is difficult to eradicate, so their treatments tend to be longer. So just a brief overview of these different guidelines. The IDSA guidelines, they use a prophylactic single dose of oral doxycycline within 72 hours of removal of a high-risk tick bite. They do recognize that the EM or bullseye rash is diagnostic for Lyme, but they then recommend 10 to 14 days of an oral antibiotic to treat that. They do use the two-tier antibody testing. And for patients with more severe Lyme, they do sometimes use 28 days of oral antibiotics or short courses of IV, including patients with neurological involvement. The International Lyme and Associated Diseases Guidelines, they use prophylaxis for a black-legged tick bite in an endemic area, which means an area that has high levels of Lyme disease, which includes Pennsylvania. They would recommend 20 days of doxycycline. They also recognize the EM or bullseye rash is diagnostic for Lyme, but they would recommend 4 to 6 weeks of antibiotics after a bullseye rash in the hopes that it would prevent those inactive and dormant persister cells. Their diagnosis can be made clinically. They do use lab testing and often use specialty labs, but they will sometimes treat based on clinical symptoms, and they will sometimes treat for ongoing symptoms as they see necessary. So, how do these unusual characteristics of Lyme bacteria affect research? So, because the diagnostic tests are inaccurate, it's difficult to determine which patients actually have active Lyme. So, that makes it really hard to study. If you don't know for sure who has active Lyme and who doesn't, it's hard to get the correct group and control groups to determine what's really effective in treating Lyme. Research may also not account for patients without antibodies who still have Lyme. It doesn't always look at persister cells, and it may not account for Herxheimer reactions. So if your study design is to give antibiotics for 2 weeks and then to look at whether patients feel better or not, if they're exhibiting a Herxheimer reaction, they may feel a lot worse. And you're going to look at that and say, well, this treatment obviously isn't working because it's making people worse instead of better. Again, confusion that occurs because of these unusual characteristics of Lyme. Study designs also have to account for all of these unusual characteristics, which in the past they have not always done. So this study cultured an entire mouse, and it's often used to tell people that antibiotics cures Lyme. So in this study, they treated Lyme-infected mice with either an antibiotic or saline for 5 days, and then they cultured the tissues. And not surprisingly, the saline-treated mice were culture positive, and the antibiotic-treated mice were culture negative. This is used as evidence to say antibiotic therapy is effective in eradicating cultivatable cells of Lyme bacteria. And that's really the key. So again, we know that the spirochetes, the active cultivatable cells, they are often killed by antibiotics, and the ones that aren't killed have gone into inactive or dormant states, which means they won't show up on a culture. So this test does not really look at whether there might have been dormant persister cells left in these mice. So it would be helpful for this study to be redone and for the mice to be allowed to survive for 6 months to see whether those inactive bacteria then revert back to spirochetes and become active, and whether the mice are then culture positive. So studies really need to be designed to take into account these characteristics. So this prophylactic study also does not really account for the dormant persister cells. So a single dose of doxycycline was given within 72 hours of tick bite, and then they looked to see whether bullseye rashes occurred in the people who got the treatment versus the control subjects. And more control subjects got bullseye rashes, so they assumed that this meant that the treatment eradicated the Lyme. Couple questions there, because we know not everyone gets bullseyes, so we don't really know if it eradicated the Lyme. They did check at 6 weeks to see if there were additional signs of Lyme or antibodies, which were negative. But again, this doesn't give enough time for those inactive cells to potentially become active. So it would be really helpful to do this study again, and then at the 6-month mark to test these people and see whether they have any symptoms for Lyme, or whether they test positive in any way. So, and then of course, we all are aware there's many additional factors that make Lyme difficult to treat. We're not going to go into any depth about co-infections and chronic symptoms, but it is another thing that makes treatment of Lyme very difficult. So in Pennsylvania, there's 11 different tick-borne pathogens. And in one study, 53% of patients with long-term symptoms from Lyme reported tick-borne co-infections confirmed by lab testing. 23% of them had one co-infection, and almost 30% reported 2 or more co-infections. And this is important because with extra infections, you need different tests and you need different treatments. So if you're only treating Lyme, this may lead to ongoing persistent symptoms if you're not dealing with all of the pathogens. So where are we now? Are we making progress? So in recent years, there has been progress on the recognition that persistent symptoms do occur after Lyme disease. Studies now are reporting anywhere from 0 to 48% of patients having persistent symptoms. The CDC now quotes symptoms related to Lyme disease are 5 to 10% more common 6 months after treatment among people who've had Lyme than among people who have not. So they are now recognizing the persistence of symptoms. And a study at Johns Hopkins, when Lyme disease patients were diagnosed early and treated promptly, 14% of them still went on to develop what they called post-treatment Lyme disease, the persistent symptoms lasting for 6 months or more, and including severe fatigue, body pain, and cognitive challenges. And then just recently, the federal Lyme definition has changed. So the federal government is now diagnosing Lyme disease as a tick-borne infection that can lead to chronic, often invisible multi-system illness. And they acknowledge even after treatment, up to 20% of patients may develop Lyme infection-associated chronic conditions and illnesses, or Lyme IACCI, with persistent fatigue, pain, cognitive issues, neurological complications, and other enduring health challenges. So what is this Lyme IACCI? So this infection-associated chronic conditions and illnesses, this really came about with long COVID, and so it relates to any of the ongoing symptoms that occur after an infection. So long COVID, chronic fatigue, maybe Epstein-Barr, POTS, some of those things, and of course, Lyme. And this definition does include that there are multiple possible underlying mechanisms. So it does include continued immune stimulation from antigens, or these are those proteins that are released into the tissue by the Borrelia. But it does include continued infection in a sequestered body site that cannot be sampled. So this was the first time the federal government acknowledged the possibility of continued infection. So again, it's progress, not where we want to end up, but we are making progress. So there's a number of other things: disordered blood clotting, persistent tissue damage, changes to the GI microbiome. But we are happy to see that there's the beginning acknowledgement of a possible continued infection. So we're going to talk a little bit about current diagnostic options. So we talked about the challenges with the standard Lyme testing. There are a couple specialty tests that it's helpful to be aware of. So the IGeneX immunoblot, one of the pros for this test is that it tests for 9 different species of Lyme bacteria versus only 1 in traditional testing. It also measures for more bands. So we talked about the Western blot. The bands are looking for antibodies that match 2 different Lyme proteins. So OOPS A and OOPS B are very common Lyme proteins, and these are not measured in the standard Lyme testing, but they are added in the IGeneX immunoblot, and they are highly specific for Lyme disease. The immunoblot also, if you look down below, the standard Western blot kind of has those black, smudgy looking images that are much harder to read. And the IGeneX immunoblot has come up with a way to make it much clearer and easier to read. IGeneX quotes the accuracy of this test at 93%, but unfortunately it is still an antibody test. So once again, people who are very sick with Lyme are going to have decreased antibody production and may still not show up positive. There's another new at-home test by AccuDart. So this is a nice option because no prescription is required and you can do it at home with a finger prick. It is processed by IGeneX, so it still tests for those many different strains of Borrelia. Unfortunately, it is still an antibody test and comes with those issues. It is also only 83% accurate, and you don't get any details in this. You just get a positive or a negative. So we do also have a couple PCR options as a possibility. So DNA Connections uses advanced DNA PCR technology, and they look for the DNA of Lyme bacteria and 10 common tick-borne diseases. This is an at-home test and no prescription is required, and they do those concentration techniques to increase the likelihood of finding the Lyme DNA. Galaxy uses a digital PCR to detect Lyme bacteria protein in the urine, and this test correlates highly with symptoms. It does require a prescription. And again, it's important to know that this PCR does not confirm an active infection, although it can be an indicator that there may be an infection. And for people who are really, really sick that may not show up on an antibody test, this can be a helpful option. So we're also going to look briefly at some studies that show current treatment options that might be helpful, particularly against these biofilms or inactive forms of Borrelia. So this was a mouse study, and it looked at persistent biofilm microcolonies, and they were not eradicated by doxycycline, ceftriaxone, or vancomycin, or double combinations. They were eradicated by a persister drug combination of daptomycin, doxycycline, and ceftriaxone. And in another mouse study, again, showed that single antibiotics did not eradicate the persister cells of Lyme. These biofilms and round bodies were only eradicated by a couple double combinations and some triple combinations. So again, if you treat for 5 years with just doxycycline, it will probably make you feel better, But as soon as you go off the doxycycline, these persister cells that are not eliminated by the doxycycline, they're going to revert into spirochetes and your symptoms may resume. So it's really critical when we're doing treatment to be thinking about all forms and to make sure that we're eradicating all the different forms of the Borrelia. So, and this was double dapsone. This is often recommended by Dr. Horowitz. So lab studies showed that dapsone alone or dapsone in combination with antibiotics decreased the mass and viability of biofilms. So this made them smaller or was able to kill them entirely. And that was in test tubes. So they also did a study with patients. 40 patients with long-term symptoms were treated with double dapsone protocol. Their tick-borne symptoms improved in 98% of the patients, with 45% remaining in remission or symptom-free for 1 year or longer. Unfortunately, there are a number of side effects with dapsone treatment, including a Herx reaction, and it is less effective if there's co-infections such as Babesia or Bartonella. But again, this is one of the ways to treat those inactive forms and hopefully eliminate the Lyme from your system. There are also a lot of integrative treatments that do address all of these different forms. We do not have time this evening to go into all the details of those, but there are herbs, essential oils, and supplement that are all effective. We have a number of doctors who have talked about this on our other VLIS. So if you're interested, I would recommend going and watching some of the videos on our website or YouTube channel. Stephen Buhner also has a number of books with protocols using natural treatments for Lyme and co-infections. And then, of course, there are many doctors that offer integrative approaches to treat Lyme. So what's next? What's coming? So we're going to look at future diagnosis. So there's a new hybrid Lyme ELISA. The ELISA is the first tier of the standard 2-tier test. The current one is not that accurate. So this is a more accurate test that would only require 1 test instead of 2. It uses antibodies that then have to bind to 2 Lyme-specific proteins. So it is able to recognize patients with early Lyme much more accurately than the current test. Unfortunately, it still relies on antibody production, so cannot tell us if it's an active infection and might be less accurate for people who have very severe cases of Lyme. But clinical trials are underway for this diagnostic test. There's also a multiplex immunoassay, and this looks at 10 antigens or like Lyme proteins and uses machine learning to determine if Lyme is present. This was found to be sensitive in both early Lyme and with post-treatment Lyme disease patients, so people with chronic Lyme symptoms. This chart is from Nicole Bell's State of Lyme 2026 presentation, which I highly recommend. If you look at the chart, early Lyme, this multiplex immunoassay was able to recognize 30 out of 30 patients with early Lyme. At 1 to 3 month post-treatment, it recognized 29 out of 29 patients. And for patients with long-term symptoms from Lyme, it was able to recognize 95% of them compared to only 43% with that standard 2-tier testing. So this would be a big improvement on Lyme testing. They are working with the FDA to get approval for manufacturing and clinical use. So hopefully this will be coming soon. So what's next for treatment? Johns Hopkins did a SLICE study, which was a pilot trial investigating the use of a 3-month course of tetracycline for treating post-treatment Lyme disease. Enrollment for this has ended and the results have not been published. But as we looked at with the pony study, tetracycline did prevent them from being culture positive. There are some much earlier studies from the 1990s that showed some effectiveness with tetracycline. It did trigger a significant Herx. Patients felt worse for several months when they started the treatment, but eventually did feel better. So it'll be interesting to find out the results from this. Flight Path Bioscience is in Northeastern, and they are pioneering microbiome sparing diseases that really target spirochetes. So this means that the antibiotics won't impact the good bacteria in your body, so that it's safer to take them for longer periods. You may have heard of hygromycin A. This was the first compound they tested, and it did go into clinical trials, but it did not have good availability in the body. They've got 2 more antibiotics in the works: formabactin A, which is in clinical stages, and lolamycin, which is in a preclinical stage. And then penicillin, this one is interesting. In mice, they did find that it's highly effective at treating Lyme disease, and it cured the infection at doses 100 times lower than doxycycline. It targets the cell wall of the Lyme bacteria to kill it, but again, does not harm the good bacteria in the GI tract. It's currently available for use in other infections, which is great because it won't have to go through safety testing, but it's only available as an IV treatment, and it's not been tested really in Lyme in people to know whether it's effective. But again, this is something that's in the pipeline and hopefully will be coming soon. There's also some clinical trials. So there's a clinical trial network affiliated with Columbia University looking at Lyme and other tick-borne diseases, and there's currently 7 clinical trials listed. So you can go to the clinical trials network and get information about those if you're interested. So in summary, we are making progress in research, diagnosis, treatment, and in the recognition of long-term or chronic Lyme. But Lyme is a complex bacteria, and it has a lot of mechanisms to survive. Its unusual characteristics have made it difficult to understand and have made diagnosis and treatment challenging. Most of us at PA Lyme have struggled or watched our loved ones struggle from tick-borne diseases, so we understand the frustration that patients feel waiting and wishing for better answers. We are fighting for better recognition, better awareness, and better answers. The good news is we're making progress. It might be slower than we want, but we are making progress. So long-term symptoms from Lyme are now being recognized. The federal government included ongoing infection as a possible cause of those long-term symptoms. Federal and private funding for Lyme research is increasing, and awareness is growing. So what can you do? You can take action. There are 3 Lyme bills active in Pennsylvania and 6 federal Lyme bills. So write letters to your legislators asking them to support Lyme legislation. You can advocate for more research funding for Center for Lyme Action. They have an advocacy day. It's virtual every year. You can sign up to do that. You can volunteer with PA Lyme. We are always looking for volunteers. There's a page on our website you can fill out, or you can reach us at info@palyme.org. And you can help us to raise awareness. So do that by educating. We've had numerous Facebook posts about the science of Lyme. Please share those widely to help educate people about the challenges of Lyme disease. And you can share this video with people, help people to understand that there is currently no good diagnostic to tell if Lyme is still present, that early studies were not well designed to account for persistence, which is creating the controversy around Lyme. Lyme disease alters the immune function and makes it hard to eliminate. And finally, and importantly, Lyme bacteria does change shape. It goes dormant, and it can persist even after antibiotics. So I hope the information has been helpful. And if anybody has questions, I'll stop sharing and see if there are any questions.
Kathy, it was a wonderful presentation.
Thanks.
A lot of time went into that, I can only imagine, right?
Yeah. Yes, read a lot of research.
I can imagine. You can tell that very well organized and a lot of depth to what you said. I got a text message here from someone. Can you comment on potential Lyme vaccines?
I did not research the Lyme vaccine. There is one that is in clinical trials, but I think we'd probably have to do a whole another presentation to cover the details of the Lyme vaccines. Currently, the last I heard, we do not have any data from those current trials to know really what we're seeing in this new vaccine. So once we have information about what those trials are showing, we will certainly share it as soon as we have the information.
Got it. And just a reminder for the audience, if you do have a question or a comment, you can put it in the Q&A question and answer folder there at the bottom.
Kathy, we did have one come in. Do you know of any relationship between Lyme and copper serum levels?
Yes. I don't know that there's any studies about it, but copper and zinc levels are should be balanced in most people. And there seems to be some relationship between Lyme and something that is called cryptopyrrole or pyroluria. And pyroluria alters metabolism of certain blood products called pyroles, and that can alter the zinc levels in your body. And then with the zinc and copper needing to be imbalanced, it can, I believe it drops your zinc levels, so it can make your copper serum seem higher or out of balance. I think there are also some other impacts with copper, but I don't know that I could tell you off the top of my head. But look into zinc copper balance, and I think there may also be an impact with metalloproteins, which may impact copper, but I, again, don't know that off the top of my head.
All right, we have another question. Can you talk about using non-traditional healing modalities along with antibiotic treatment?
Yeah, so I mean, it's certainly possible to do that. Again, so if you're on, say, doxycycline long term and that's helping, you might want to add something additional to be able to impact those round bodies or biofilms. So there's some enzymes that can do that. There's other natural compounds, which I looked up today and don't remember all of them, but if you look at Mariah Henchy and Dr. Shore's presentation, they actually have the information about which of those natural compounds impact biofilms. I think garlic oil and black pepper. Anyway, there are a number of natural compounds that would impact those biofilms in round bodies. So I would check those sources and again, talk to your healthcare provider before adding substances, but that's a way to get some more information about which natural compounds are most effective.
All right, thank you. We have another question. Is there a connection between high-level exposure to mercury and chronic Lyme?
I do not know.
All right, let me, if anyone has more questions, yeah, please drop them in the chat. Let me check Facebook real quick for questions. Yeah, not seeing any questions at this time.
If another question doesn't come in, we can slowly wrap it up. I think probably one of the most useful aspects of your presentation, Kathy, is going to be that the recording will be on the website, the slide deck will be there. It is information, just as you said, towards the end of your presentation. Share it with your physician, share it with your, primary care physician, get the information out there. it does seem like there is movement within the Lyme disease, arena as to more information is becoming known. It seems like some of the walls are coming down, allowing for alternative viewpoints. It's very challenging, as most of you on the call tonight know, that dogma's been around for a while. So the old school and the old guard has had an opportunity to become very entrenched in the opinion of the last couple of decades. So it's going to take a lot of effort to slowly bring down some of those walls. And I think, as most people know, the research that goes into Lyme disease is very shallow. You look at some of the other diseases, they get a lot of funding. Lyme disease does not get that level of funding. So it'll be a slow road. But I like how you ended it, Kathy, that there is hope. For the individual that asked about the natural protocols, some of them take longer. It is not an exact science. Your practitioner, there will be a little bit of, trial to get to what works for you. One of the more challenging aspects of treating for those with chronic Lyme is what works for one may not work for the next person. So it's a very personalized disease. When you look at the genetic biome and your makeup, there may be genetic predispositions as to why certain things work more or better for you, or not as well as it does others. So sticking with it is an important thing. And I don't know, Bill, if anything else showed up.
I did look up the
Yeah.
studies from Dr. Shore. So for those who are interested, the study is called Evaluation of Natural and Botanical Medicines for Activity Against Growing and Non-Growing Forms of Borrelia. And he does talk at the end about which ones are helpful against the inactive forms. So folks can look that up if they're interested.
And along with those lines, on our website is Dr. Maria Henschy's slide deck. She was a speaker at the April patient conference. She runs LymeCore Botanicals, and she really laid out her process to determine which natural nutraceuticals were effective on certain bacteria, viral microbes, pathogens, and which ones had overlap. So she kind of walks you through her thought process to get to the conclusion that if you're diagnosed, for instance, Bartonella, Babesia, Borrelia miyamotoi, then there might be 8 or 9 different nutraceuticals that could be effective, but there might be a combination of 3 that are specific to those 3 pathogens. So her slide deck is on our website.
She often recommends Japanese knotweed and Chinese skullcap and ashwagandha are kind of some of her big 3. But again, go look at her material, because she will also cover what they cover in different forms and stuff.
Hey, we had 2 more questions come in. One came in via Facebook saying that the chat on Zoom is disabled. That is true, but there's a Q&A feature in Zoom. So if you see that, you can ask your question. However, I do see your question on Facebook. So Kathy, the question is there any overarching differences between Lyme in children versus Lyme in adults?
Yes. Treatment would probably be similar, but symptoms in children can be quite different from symptoms in adults, particularly children who get it in early development. We actually just did a brochure recently called Dare to Recognize, which really focused on the issues in children. So children are a little bit more likely to develop symptoms of PANS, which is pediatric acute onset neuropsychiatric symptom. And that would include things like motor and vocal tics, urinary incontinence, sometimes eating disorders, OCD. Some of them develop rage, sensory issues. So a lot of those things are a little bit more common in children. And we do see other psychiatric manifestations more commonly in children. So kids are more likely to get diagnosed ADD or ADHD, or to receive an autism diagnosis sometimes can be related to Lyme, particularly if you have a child who is like 12 and they suddenly develop autistic symptoms, that can be a red flag for Lyme and tick-borne diseases. So, yeah, we do see some different symptoms in children. And I don't think that there's any research, but there are some questions if, and there's research going on right now about whether Lyme transmits in utero and whether that will cause different issues in children. And that research is going on at Children's National right now. So hopefully we'll have more information about that soon.
Okay, thank you. Another question has come in. Forgive me if I don't pronounce it correctly, is ceftriaxone effective against persister cells?
So that one study that we looked at in mice implied that no, it does not eliminate persister cells. So it would need to be done in combination with something else. And right, it could be a prescription biofilm buster or perhaps a natural thing that would be effective against those persister cells.
All right, that's the end of the questions for now.
And it's not a question as much as just a comment to you, Kathy. And the attendee says, excellent presentation and information. Thank you so much. So, we look at when PA Lyme does educational seminars and virtual Lyme presentations, sometimes we'll get 10 people in the audience, sometimes we'll get 50, but we all believe that if it helps one person, the right person at the right time, it was well worth our time. What Kathy said is accurate, that not only the regional leaders that are a part of PA Lyme, but also those on the board and many of the volunteers. Not only do we all either suffer from chronic Lyme or have had it in our past or our children, but the impetus to want to volunteer is just to do something to make a difference, to try to do something to help the next person not have to go through a lot of the trials and tribulations that we went through. So if we can help just one, then it was well worth the time. One comment, I got a text message here where, Kathy, you were talking about biofilms, but the person was making more of a comment than a question. And it's accurate what their assessment is, that if you're going to really concentrate on breaking up biofilms, just recognize you may be eradicating the layer between your immune system and the bacteria. And in doing so, you might now give your immune system an opportunity to have at it and go after, the field of bacteria that's underneath the biofilm. So, make sure you're detoxing. Be aware that you might put yourself into a Herx situation. So, not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but just recognize that very positively could be, just a cause and effect if you do go after the biofilm.
So yes, a good point. It's important to do it very slowly because you don't want to trigger a huge Herx. You want to try to keep low and slow when you're treating so that you don't make everything worse. Yeah.
Right. Kathy, any last words of wisdom?
I mean, I covered most all that I wanted to cover.
This is as wise as you're going to get at the moment. So,
Yep, it's
you put a lot of work into it, and we're very appreciative. So, with that, so pay attention for more information. With May Lyme Awareness Month, we still have a couple of weeks where we are taking portions of Kathy's research and we're getting it out to the community, either through social or through email. We will be letting people know how they can plug into the virtual support group for individuals new with Lyme. And I will say to those couple of individuals that signed up over the last hour for FullScript, thank you for paying attention. We will be getting more information out to the group. So with that, let's just call it an evening. Bill, thank you very much. Kathy, you as well. So good night. We'll
Thanks,
talk to you
Kathy.
soon.
Good night.
good night.
Bye bye now.